Rachmanism. The term Rachmanism evokes images of squalid housing conditions, landlord exploitation, and racial discrimination in post-war Britain. Named after Peter Rachman, a notorious London landlord during the 1950s and early 1960s, Rachmanism came to symbolize a particular form of unscrupulous property management that preyed upon society's most vulnerable members, especially immigrants and the working-class poor. Rachman's name became synonymous with a larger system of housing injustice and neglect, exposing deep flaws within the British housing market and the legal frameworks governing landlord-tenant relations. This essay explores the rise and influence of Rachmanism in British society, examining the historical context that allowed it to flourish, its defining characteristics, the victims it impacted, and the social and political responses it provoked. It concludes by assessing its enduring legacy in shaping housing policy and public attitudes towards property rental and urban development. The post-war context. To understand Rachmanism, one must begin with the broader historical and socio-economic landscape of post-Second World War Britain. The war had left much of the country's housing stock damaged or destroyed, particularly in major urban centres like London, Liverpool, and Birmingham. In the wake of the Blitz and years of economic strain, the British government faced an acute housing shortage. Many returning servicemen and their families found themselves living in overcrowded or substandard dwellings, while immigration from Commonwealth countries increased demand for accommodation even further. Government initiatives, such as the construction of council housing and the passing of rent control laws, were aimed at protecting tenants and preventing homelessness. However, these regulations also had unintended consequences. Rent controls, introduced during wartime and carried forward into peacetime, made it unprofitable for landlords to maintain or invest in their properties. This disincentive led to widespread disrepair and, paradoxically, created fertile ground for exploitation. It was in this climate of scarcity and desperation that Peter Rachman rose to notoriety. Who was Peter Rachman? Peter Rachman was a Polish-born immigrant who arrived in Britain after the Second World War. He initially served in the Polish forces under British command and later settled in London. In the early 1950s, Rachman began purchasing properties in the Notting Hill area of West London, a district that had become a hub for recent immigrants, particularly from the Caribbean. Rachman's methods were as cunning as they were controversial. His business model revolved around acquiring rent-controlled properties, often ones that housed long-term white British tenants, and then forcibly or indirectly driving those tenants out. Once the properties were vacated, Rachman would refurbish them minimally and let them out at exorbitant prices to new tenants who were not protected under rent control legislation, most often poor black immigrants who had little alternative but to accept whatever accommodation they could find. Rachman's empire grew rapidly. At the height of his career, he reportedly owned or managed over 100 properties. He died suddenly in 1962, aged just 43, but not before his name became emblematic of a larger crisis in British housing. Characteristics of Rachmanism. Rachmanism as a term extended beyond the actions of Peter Rachman himself. It came to define a broader pattern of landlord malpractice that included 1. Tenant harassment and eviction. Landlords employing Rachmanite tactics used coercive methods to evict rent-controlled tenants. This harassment included neglecting repairs, cutting off essential services such as water and electricity, and even hiring thugs to intimidate residents. 2. Exploitation of immigrant communities. With limited rights, minimal income, and facing racial discrimination, many immigrants had few housing choices. Rachman and others like him exploited this vulnerability, often cramming multiple families into single flats and charging them inflated rents. 3. Negligence and disrepair. Properties managed under Rachmanism were typically left in dismal condition. Sewage leaks, lack of heating, mold infestations, and faulty wiring were commonplace. Landlords deliberately avoided maintenance, knowing that tenants had little recourse. 4. Legal evasion. By targeting tenants who were not covered by rent control, either because they were new arrivals or because the property had been illegally subdivided, Rachmanite landlords found loopholes in the law. This allowed them to charge unregulated rents and escape accountability. Notting Hill and the epicenter of Rachmanism. Notting Hill, now one of London's most fashionable districts, was in the 1950s a different world. The area was characterized by overcrowding, poverty, and racial tension. It was here that Rachman built his empire and where the consequences of Rachmanism were most acutely felt. This period saw the eruption of race riots in 1958, sparked by ongoing hostilities between white working-class residents and newly arrived West Indian immigrants. The violence exposed not only racial animosities but also the dire housing situation that exacerbated community tensions. For many immigrants, their only housing options were the slums of landlords like Rachman. These slums lacked basic sanitation and security. Children grew up in rodent-infested basements, families slept in shifts due to lack of space. While these conditions were tolerated out of necessity, they left a lasting mark on Britain's social fabric. Media and political attention. The national media played a significant role in drawing attention to Rachmanism. Sensationalist reports detailed the grim conditions of tenants and the excesses of landlords. Rachman was often depicted as a shadowy figure, mingling with celebrities and politicians while exploiting the poor. The News of the World and Daily Mail ran exposes that painted a portrait of greed, corruption, and systemic failure. In Parliament, questions were raised about how such practices could continue unchecked. Rachmanism became a rallying cry for those demanding stronger tenant protections and greater oversight of private landlords. This pressure culminated in political action. The Rent Act of 1965, passed under Harold Wilson's Labour government, aimed to close the loopholes exploited by landlords and introduced measures to regulate the private rental market more effectively. The legal and political response. The Rent Act 1965 was a watershed moment in British housing policy. It marked the first substantial effort to provide legal protection to tenants in furnished accommodation, who had previously fallen outside the scope of earlier legislation. Key provisions of the Act included security of tenure for many tenants, regardless of whether the accommodation was furnished. Rent tribunals to determine fair rents and mediate disputes. Regulation of eviction practices, making it harder for landlords to expel tenants without due cause. While the Act did not eliminate all forms of exploitation, it sent a clear message that Rachmanite practices would no longer be tolerated. It also contributed to a broader trend towards social responsibility in housing, with increased emphasis on public sector involvement. Long-term impacts and legacy. Though Peter Rachman died over 60 years ago, the legacy of Rachmanism continues to influence British society and policy. Several long-term impacts are worth noting. 1. Housing policy reform. The horrors of Rachmanism played a crucial role in shaping modern landlord-tenant law. It spurred a shift toward greater regulation, stronger tenant rights, and improved housing standards. Many of today's legal protections can trace their origins to the public outcry provoked by Rachmanism. 2. Public perception of landlords. Rachmanism contributed to a long-standing suspicion of private landlords in British culture. The dodgy landlord stereotype, often portrayed in film and literature, owes much to this era. Public trust in the private rental market has remained relatively low, and debates about rent caps, eviction bans, and housing affordability remain highly contentious. 3. Urban renewal and gentrification. Ironically, areas once associated with Rachmanite slums, such as Notting Hill, have since undergone dramatic gentrification. While this has brought investment and development, it has also led to displacement and the erosion of working-class communities. The cycle of neglect followed by regeneration raises complex questions about who benefits from urban redevelopment. 4. Race and housing. Rachmanism highlighted the intersection of race and housing inequality in post-war Britain. It exposed how Black and immigrant communities were systematically marginalized not just socially, but structurally. This legacy continues in present-day discussions about the racial dimensions of housing access and homelessness. Conclusion. Rachmanism stands as a dark chapter in British housing history, a term that encapsulates greed, cruelty, and systemic failure. While Peter Rachman was a real individual, his name came to symbolize much more than his own actions. Rachmanism became shorthand for an exploitative system that profited from scarcity, inequality, and racism. Its exposure galvanized social and political reform, leading to legislative change and a revaluation of the responsibilities of landlords and the rights of tenants. Yet, many of the underlying issues, housing shortages, unaffordability, and exploitation, persist in contemporary Britain. The lessons of Rachmanism remain relevant today as policymakers, activists, and citizens continue to grapple with the challenge of ensuring safe, fair, and affordable housing for all. In remembering Rachmanism, we are reminded not only of past injustices but of the urgent need to prevent their recurrence. It serves as a powerful warning about what happens when housing is treated solely as a commodity, and not as a basic human right.